Without further ado, I'd like to introduce us to Dr. Alastair Meredith in Joburg, and he's going to be talking us through his highlights of Strauss Co.'s current online sale of modern post-war contemporary art and Asian arts, jewelry, and wine. Thank you, Al.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. Matt, would you mind just making sure everybody's on mute, just so we don't get any background sound? Cool, thanks so much. Yeah, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Yes, it's something that we've been trying for the last few days in light of what's going on. I think certainly all the specialists, both in Johannesburg and Cape Town, have really enjoyed this feature. It's also allowed us individually to look more carefully at some of the lots in our current online sale. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to share my screen with you now. I hope you can all see it. And I've selected a handful of I suppose some of my highlights from the current online auction. I'll be going through lot 542, which is the wonderful Peter Venning etching of a Johannesburg landscape, as well as a Derde Poort lino cut of houses with trees by Henk Pierneef. I'll look at the Senil's Lake Kivu, as well as this wonderful etching by Anton Kannemeyer called My DH, and then also the Sipho Ndlovu work, the painting Cattleman in Villiers. So I do have some slides so you can maybe see some of the things a little bit better. Okay, so the first two are these, 542 and 36. The one on the left is, of course, the Venning etching, and the one on the right is the Pierneef lino cut. These two artists are two of my favorite artists, artists that we would loosely refer to as early Highveld school artists. Their careers overlapped. Both Pierneef and Venning knew each other very well, and they each had a huge influence on the other's work. The gentleman on the left is Peter Venning. He was born in The Hague in 1873. I think we always think of Venning as having a rather sad existence. This photograph is of him on his wedding day, which gives you, I suppose, some idea of his general demeanor. But he lived most of his life in enormous poverty. And very much struggled through his life, having married a widow with 2 children in 1898. And then the picture on the right is, of course, a much older Henk Pierneef painting on plein air. I'm guessing probably there in the 1950s, maybe late 1940s. Anyway, I told you Venning was born in The Hague in 1873. In about 1898, he joins J.H. Debussy in Amsterdam. They were the largest publishing house in Amsterdam, and I'm showing you their buildings on Rokin. I think it's pronounced Rokin in Amsterdam. That's the image on the left, although I think that's a slightly later iteration of the facade. And in 1905, he and his wife decide to take an opportunity presented by J.H. Debussy to go and open a store in Pretoria. And they take the boat. They arrive in Cape Town in the middle of 1905. They then take another boat up to Durban, and they eventually get to Pretoria in the latter months of 1905. The image on the right there, you'll see the J.H. Debussy store just next to the Kudu Butchery. It also, incidentally, was the space where Henk Pierneef staged his first solo exhibition in 1913. Venning was very active, you know, on the artistic scene in Pretoria at the time. When I say he was very active, there were barely a handful of artists working there. He was very influential in forming the first I suppose, a loosely bound group of artists in Pretoria in the early 20th century, a group that identified itself as the individualists. And they first started showing works together in 1910, 1911. This is a photograph from that time. You can see Venning. I hope you can see my cursor moving, but Venning's over there with his wonderful pointed beard. And this gentleman standing in the middle is a very, very young Henk Pierneef in 1910, 1911. Pierneef was born in 1886, so certainly a very young man. You can also see in an image like this, two wonderful bronze busts, this one of President M.T.S. Steyn, and this one a portrait bust of Pierneef by Pierneef's great friend and sculptor, Fani Elof. I told you that Venning was very poor. He certainly was. He eked out a living. But after a few years, he managed to save up enough money to import a etching press from Holland, which he did. And he starts making etchings, I think probably around 1906, 1907 in Pretoria. He's also painting works like this wonderful evening scene in Harmony in Pretoria, as well as this fantastic cloudscape also in Pretoria. You can see the Union buildings on Mentjieskop over there with its terracotta tiles. And I always imagine Venning sort of trooping around this marshland around the Apies River, painting scenes that took his fancy. Materials for him were difficult to come by, and you can imagine how much value he put in his actual materials, his canvases and his brushes, and his oil paints too. These are the kind of works that Venning is far more well known for. 1913, Venning meets D.C. Boonzai. Now, D.C. Boonzai was, of course, Gregoire's father, and he was a cartoonist. And in 1916, Venning goes down to Cape Town. It's a bit of a break for him, I suppose. And he paints flat out in Cape Town, having never really traveled the area before. And he paints works like the one I'm showing you here. Marvelous grade Cape scenes with a wonderful silhouette of the mountain, these very tall sentinel pine trees. And I think these are the kind of works, that really made his name, this sort of early Cape Impressionism that he was so influential in establishing, along with someone like Hugo Naudy. Very quickly, between some of these, just always take a note at his signature on the bottom right over there, as well as over there. And as I show you some more, and these are more Cape paintings painted from 1916 onwards, you'll see how the signatures differ. And there's certainly a lot of ideas and theories as to why the signature is so very inconsistent. I think, like so many artists, he was self-conscious and very often
aging doctor
signed his pictures. Also, we know that many of them were signed by another hand at a later stage. Anyway, back to this work that's on our current sale. I'm showing you to give you some kind of idea of its scale. On the right, it's a very, very small impression, an etching. We've called it sort of near the mines, but it has also been catalogued before as a deserted street scene. But you'll see that sort of mine shaft in the background, right in the middle of the composition. Where does a work like this come from? Bearing in mind at the time, this is about 1910 to 1912, there wasn't much of a market for these kind of works in Pretoria and Johannesburg. But this particular work comes from this portfolio called Johannesburg Impressions. I'm showing you the cover sleeve of the second series on the left. But it included 12 etchings of Johannesburg. I forgot to mention that that Venning did move to Johannesburg briefly to run the shop, the Debussy shop, a stationery shop there. and left, I suppose, after a relatively short period of time. But during this period, he creates this wonderful set of differently sized views and vignettes of what was a very young mining town. Here are two of them, an open worked stope on the left, and then the one on the right is or Farm Bezuidenhout or Bears Valley, as we would know it today. You can see the smokestacks on the horizon, the sort of early evidence of the burgeoning mining scene there in 1912. There's another, I suppose, similarly related work in the sale. It's by Gwelo Goodman. It's the one I'm showing you on the right, another sort of mining scene. Gwelo Goodman came up to Johannesburg in 1917, which is when this watercolor would have been produced. And there are a number of remarkable works that he executed during that visit, including this one, which is one of my absolute favorites. An incredible garden with these wonderful garlands of flowers. And you expect it to be I suppose, a beautiful back garden summer day scene, but sort of in the middle background there, you of course see the workings of the mining industry, a very strange and beautiful mixture of nature and out and out mechanization and industry. Finally, I suppose, before I move on to the next one, I'd like to point out that despite a work like this being so special in terms of its art historical importance as well as its sheer quality, these trade at incredibly low values. This work is estimated at 2,000 to 4,000 rand. I think it has a starting point of 1,500 rand, which is just absolutely crazy. Not only when you think about its historical significance, but when you also bear in mind how influential Wenning was with his recently imported etching press on the young careers of so many major artists, including the likes of Henk Pierneef. Anyway, moving on to the next work, the Pierneef liner cut. The work on the left is a little sketch by Pierneef. You can see his initials on the left there, JHP, and it's dated 1910. You'll also notice the title, which is Pieter Wenning, Pretoria. This is a young Henk Pierneef sketching his early mentor, Pieter Wenning, sketching himself in the open fields. And I'm showing it to you just to emphasize how close these artists were. This was a very small group of Highveld artists, and they certainly helped each other as well as exhibited each other. The other major artists that are working at the time, just to mention them, include Anton van Vo, George Smithard, and Frans Oerder. And along with Wenning and Pierneef, those are the sort of big hitters on the Highveld at the turn of the century. Anyway, the Pierneef liner cut is the one I'm showing you now on the right. It's a work called Houses and Trees in Dertepoort. Pierneef, of course, is far better known for these kind of paintings. This is a work near Tabazimbi, dates from 1943. In many ways, the peak of his familiar style and his fame and his success. These are paintings typically of about 45 by 60 centimeters, relatively stylized, instantly recognizable with these wonderful camel thorns, these sky-reaching acacias, and often, like the one I'm showing you here, with these wonderful geometric simplified elements, creating this sort of wonderful tracery through which you can view the background sky and the mountains. He also, I think, is I think importantly being recognized more for his wonderful impressionist tendencies, like you'd see in a work like this. This is just a detail. I've just sort of blown it up to give you an idea of how he was able to imbibe some of the impressionist tendencies, certainly after his very important trip to Europe in 1925. He, of course, arrived back early in the February of 1926. But Pierneef, like Wenning, was a master printmaker. And he produced an enormous number of lino cuts and etchings throughout his career. And I suppose some rather idiosyncratic elements to Pierneef prints and multiples. And I'll go through some of them in a moment. This is one of his, I suppose, more famous etchings. It's of Okahanja in what was then Southwest Africa. He visited there first in 1923 and again in 1924. You'll see this is numbered, number 41 out of 100, which is quite unusual for Pierneef. It also has a little inscription there, IMPR, which stands for the Latin impressit, which essentially signifies the fact that Pierneef himself pulled this. You know, nowadays printmakers work directly with artists to produce editions and sets of prints. Pierneef did everything himself, from the preparation of the plate to the actual wood cutting, obviously, and the final pulling the print too. It's another one of his works, this dated 1925. It is, of course, the Union Building seen through this camel thorn, one of his more famous works. His willow tree, his very beloved Wilgeboom, that he depicted feverishly, really, from about 1910 onwards, when he moved into his home on De Waal Street in Pretoria with his first wife, Agatha. They had a big willow tree in their garden, and he was besotted by these cascading leaves and the wonderful decorative properties that the willow created in terms of its silhouette. Anyway, back to the actual item on our sale. It's this work. This is it in its current frame. And again, you'll see the signature, of course, J.H. Pierneef, which is signed in pencil. It is dated 1919, and it has that IMPR on the right there, which again confirms that Pierneef himself pulled that print. I told you there were some odd elements to Pierneef prints and multiples. You know, nowadays artists are very controlled in terms of their edition sizes and their numbers, rightly so. Pierneef never really thought in those terms. He didn't think about how he could retain value by controlling his edition sizes. He essentially pulled prints when he decided to and distributed them how he pleased. He often sent them away as cards or little gifts, or handed them over to friends and acquaintances. They weren't necessarily seen as high value, top selling items. And that certainly changed nowadays. Incidentally, I told you that Pierneef went to Europe in 1925. He arrived in London, I think, in the July of that year. And the first thing he did was go to the Victoria and Albert Museum with a clutch of his own liner cuts. And the V&A bought the group on the spot, which is always a nice anecdote, and I suppose gives you some sense of the quality of his work, you know, the quality that was recognized, you know, by a museum that didn't necessarily know his output too well. 1919 is also a very interesting time for Pierneef, sort of biographically. He started working for the State Library in 1907, 1908, and he only gave up his job there in 1917, 1918. He worked for a full decade at the State Library. I think a lot of us think of artists nowadays as being able to work when they choose, with no other distractions. Artists in the early 20th century and all the way through to the middle of the 20th century in South Africa inevitably had real jobs sort of alongside their artistic practice. But when he did leave the State Library, he took up a teaching position. and he was there for about a year, and he left in 1919. And this is, I suppose, the early stages of Pierneef striking out as a full-time professional artist. He goes down to Stellenbosch in 1920, 1920, exhibits there, and then, as I mentioned earlier, he goes to Southwest Africa in 1923 and 1924. And I think I would argue that the work he produced in the teens and the very early 20s is some of his most exciting. It's also the time that he's, I suppose, in the process of leaving his first wife, Agatha. She was 12 years his senior. At this point, she was struggling horribly with mental health issues, as well as issues with her sight. And they eventually separate in 1922, 1923. And Agatha successfully sues him for desertion, £500, as well as all the household furniture. So this was a time where he wasn't exactly flush. You'll notice in the cataloging of this work that we put in brackets, I think Nederland 42 or Nederland 46. If you don't know what that is, it's a reference to this book on the left. This is essentially the first catalog raisonné of Pierneef's liner cuts and etchings, his prints, produced by Nederland and published by Balkema in 1974. This has always been seen as the Bible of Pierneef prints. It's a book that's quite difficult to get hold of at the moment, and you could comfortably pay 3, 4, 5,000 rand for a copy in rubbish condition, but an essential book in terms of the study of Pierneef prints. More recently, the Nederland book has been revised by Gerard de Campe and Chris de Klerk through the University of Pretoria. And that's the book I'm showing you on the right. I think that was published probably about, I'm guessing, 3, 4, 5 years ago. They very much used Nederland as a foundation, but have added other works that Nederland had been unaware of at the time. Also a very useful book, and I think we actually have a collector's edition on this current online auction. My third work is lot 265. It's by Sipho Ndlovu. It's from 2016. I'll be honest, it's not the kind of picture I would ordinarily choose. Painted far more recently. But I think a lot of you will know this artist for his very unusual stretched canvas shapes. These are the kind of examples that we tend to see from Sipho Ndlovu more regularly, these sort of trompe-l'œil drawers and cupboards that seem to be pulled out to reveal sort of various vignettes or scenes within them. I'm showing you the front of the canvas on the left, and of course the back of the canvas, so you can see very clearly that these canvases are very uniquely and purposefully shaped. Here's another one, a sort of double draw coming out with sort of a ploughing scene, a contemporary ploughing scene in the foreground, and another one in the background, which to me is most likely influenced by little Julius and Fete sculptures. This work called Ploughing. More recently, Sipho Ndlovu has been painting works like this, these wonderful contemporary scenes of people at work, particularly farm hands and farmers with their implements and accessories, out on their land. Seemingly very prosaic, very simple scenes, but I think very humble and also rich, not to mention beautiful paintings in themselves. And I suppose the reason I decided to select this Sipho Ndlovu is also to maybe emphasize how art historians and art collectors can view works in a different light, and I mean that more specifically in terms of an art historical discourse. trying to feed contemporary works into a much longer historical lineage of similarly themed works. So, I mean, these are very simple examples, but of course you can look at the theme that Sipho Ndlovu is looking at in a work on the left and compare it to what Millet was doing at the Barbizon School in France in the mid-19th century. His very, very famous depictions of seed sowers, men and women, peasants ploughing in the fields, usually in very difficult, hard conditions. The work I'm showing you on the right here is his famous work called Potato Planters. This dates from, I think, 1861. But artists in completely different contexts working along similar themes. Of course, I can't mention something like that without also alluding to the general genre of portraiture that we're seeing here, which is an equestrian portrait. This is a hugely important historical line of major works. The one on the right here is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, painted by Titian in 1548, housed in the Prado, I think it is. The Velasquez depiction of Philip IV from 1635, also in the Prado. Jim Crack on Newmarket Heath with three small portraits, the one on the left, the horse's trainer, the stable lad, as George Stubbs called him, and of course the jockey. This dates from 1765, a work that has been traced in terms of its provenance all the way from where it was first sold in about 1780 at Christie's in London, until more recently when it sold, I think, in about 2015 for about £22 million. This is, of course, pre-photography. You'll see the horses galloping in the background with these sort of arched strides, the kind of athletic position that the naked eye could understand without the assistance of photography, which of course came a bit later. This is Night and Death by Albrecht Dürer, an incredible wood engraving from 1513, and of course the very, very famous Napoleon crossing the Alps, of which there are 5 versions, incidentally. I'm showing you the 3rd version, painted in 1802. This is the first Versailles version, but of course a very, very important, famous work by David, using the horse to give the emperor, I suppose, extra stature as well as power and significance. This is Rubens's depiction of Philip II. This dates from 1628. I'm showing it to you mainly because it relates very closely to a related portrait by Kehinde Wiley, the American painter, I suppose most famous for painting Barack Obama. He, of course, tops the steed with the king of pop, Michael Jackson. This is before the documentary that very much finally ruined his reputation in the eyes of the world. But of course, using an art historical type or a motif to make more contemporary remarks. Lot 380 is an etching by Anton Kannemeyer, a very unusual work. I'll be honest, I didn't know about this work until our sale opened on Monday. It's in our Cape Town office, so I haven't seen it in the flesh, but I absolutely love this work. You'll see on the left here, it is P/P 2/3. That stands for Printer's Proof, number 2 of 3. That is to say that when Anton Kannemeyer produced this printed edition, alongside the actual final edition, he did 3 printer's proofs. They would, I suppose, historically be given to the actual master printmaker, hence the terminology. And of the 3, this is number 2. You often see AP, which stands for artist's proof, and those, of course, as it would suggest, would be works kept by the artist himself. This work is unusual for Anton Kannemeyer in many ways. I will read you the engraving, I suppose. It says, "I've grown a red beard behind which I shall take as much cover henceforth as I can, like a creature under a bush. My dear God, I've been miserable this autumn." And it says D.H. Lawrence in 1911. Now, those of you who don't know Anton Kannemeyer, this is him on the right, in front of one of his larger watercolor or gouache works. He is a satirical artist, along with his sort of partner in crime, Conrad Watussi. They're the two of them here. There's Anton on the left and Conrad Watussi on the right, and their sort of artistic impressions of each other from a multiple from 2006. But Anton Kannemeyer has this unique, immediately recognizable aesthetic, I suppose in many ways, or most easily described as being Hergé-esque or Tintinesque. You'll see a lot of the same kind of aesthetic in the great Belgian's illustrations. A lot of his work, despite appearing light-hearted or cartoonish or illustrative, is deeply political, disturbingly satirical often. And I think in many ways that has worked against him in some people's eyes. His work is sometimes incredibly funny, brilliantly clever, but it is work that often is seen as stirring controversy. That's certainly, I don't think, the artist's intention, but inevitably the kind of motifs he develops often, I suppose, has landed him in hot water. The one on the left is from his Alphabet of Democracy series. Z is for Zuma, of course. And the one on the left is in fact on our current online auction. The Greetings from South Africa, with Tintin very much, well, a Tintin-like figure, very much running for his life, is not in the sale, but one of his very well-known images. Anton and Conrad were at university together in Stellenbosch, and from the late 1980s, both being enormous comic book fans or graphic novel fans, they started producing more contemporary, topical graphic novels for a South African context, and they became known as Bitter Comics, and they released their first version, I think, in 1992, and I think to date they have produced 17, of which all of them are shown here on the screen. I think the last was published maybe 4 or 5 years ago. These are remarkable works, ingenious works in many ways, not to mention enormously skillful and hilarious, but they're not the sort of comic book that you would maybe hand over to a 12 or 13-year-old boy. It's certainly not Beano. But anyway, getting back to this work, I told you I didn't know much about it, but I was very interested in that D.H. Lawrence quote, not entirely because I'm growing my own red beard during this lockdown, but I did wonder in what context Anton Kannemeyer viewed that quote, and I did a little bit of digging into it, but before I go through it, you'll see this, I suppose, this Cape pine tree taking up the majority of the composition on the right, and this wonderful lined portrait of a squinting D.H. Lawrence with his hat and his now very famous red beard. These are works by Anton Kannemeyer, certainly are perhaps some of my favorite examples by the artist. They are pine trees or Cape pines on the slopes of the mountain. He did a wonderful series of these works, beautifully delicate, and any of you that have driven past them will recognize them immediately. but it's certainly repeated in this work over here. D.H. Lawrence was, of course, the hugely important early 20th century writer and poet. This is him on the left with his sister Ada Clark. This post-dates the quote given by Anton Kannemeyer, because you'll see him there under his parasol with his beard very much intact. But D.H. Lawrence most famous for works like Rainbow and Sons and Lovers, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was banned for many, many years. I think it was, I think the ban was only dropped in about 1960. But these are works that were filled with strong sexual imagery, which for the time was certainly not acceptable in many people's eyes. And that is, I think, the very obvious link between Anton Kannemeyer and D.H. Lawrence. Both of them brilliant, and both of them courting controversy. Anyway, I told you I looked into this quote a little bit. The wonderful thing about D.H. Lawrence's correspondence is that so much of it is so well documented. And this quote comes from not a letter in 1911, but in fact a letter dated the 16th of October 1914. And it's a letter that D.H. Lawrence wrote from a rather miserable cottage called the Triangle, which was in Chesham, in the UK, and he wrote this letter to Amy Lowell, the American poet. And as I say, it was in fact on the 16th of October, 1914. It is not the full quote. The full quote, in fact, reads, "But I've been seedy, and I've grown a red beard, behind which I shall take as much cover henceforth as I can, like a creature under a bush. My dear God, I've been miserable this autumn, enough to turn into wood and be a graven image of myself." And I think that's also interesting, that Anton Kannemeyer decided to leave that element out. Quite why, of course, I don't think we'll ever know. He might not have had any real intention to do so. But I suppose these are the kind of things that art historians love digging for. The other important thing to know is this is a hugely significant moment for D.H. Lawrence growing this beard, because prior to the October of 1914, he was very much clean-shaven. This is him, or two images of him on the right before he sent that letter to Amy Lowell. But you'll see he's far more fresh-faced. The other thing I like about it is that in the quote, he gives a suggestion that the beard will give him some kind of armor, some kind of cover, some sort of camouflage, when of course, I suppose rather ironically, it was his beard that very much came to define him in terms of his aesthetic and his look. These are the kind of images that I think we're all very familiar with. There is a little South African connection to D.H. Lawrence. This is the earliest known oil portrait of D.H. Lawrence. It was painted in 1920. It is the earliest example held by the National Portrait Gallery in London. It is rarely on display, but it does come out occasionally. And it was painted by a South African artist. It was painted by an artist called Ndlovu. You'll see the signature in the top left corner and the date of 1920. Now, Juta left Cape Town in 1913. You'll be familiar with the name from Juta Books, Juta Publishing. Juta's grandfather, in fact, started Juta Books in the Cape in the 1850s. He was married to Louisa Marx, who was Karl Marx's sister, which is why so many rather early, obscure Karl Marx texts were in fact published in Cape Town. They were published, I suppose, under some kind of duress by his brother-in-law. But Juta, young Juta, the artist, leaves Cape Town in 1913. He goes up to Oxford just before the war. He doesn't take his degree. He spends some time at the Slade School during the war. and then he finds himself in Rome in 1919, 1920. He was sort of loosely affiliated with the British school there. But that is where he happened to meet D.H. Lawrence. Quite how they struck up a relationship, we don't know exactly, but they became very close very quickly. And in 1921, when D.H. Lawrence was, there he is up here with his wife Frida, when D.H. Lawrence and Frida were living in this little house called Fontavecchia in Taormina, Jan Juter went to visit him. And in 1920, I suppose alone in the small little cliff-top villa, Jan Juter painted this rather enigmatic portrait of D.H. Lawrence. The next year, D.H. Lawrence got Jan Juter to illustrate his travel log called Sea in Sardinia. That was published first in 1921 in New York and 1923 in London. But these are three of the wonderful, very simplified geometric images that Juter produced to illustrate that book. If you can see on the camera here, this is the first edition. I'll try and find some of the images. The images were only in fact included in the first edition. Thereafter, I suppose because of such poor sales, it was too expensive to print with them. Juter went on to other major I suppose state parastatal commissions, including contributing to the decorative program at South Africa House in the mid-1930s, along with a number of great South African artists, including the likes of Kurt Steenberg, that's him on the left, carving out the Bartholomew Diaz sculpture in the niche, on the corner of Duncannon and the Strand on Trafalgar Square, Anton van Vaux with this wonderful little bronze fountain, John Henry Amschewitz, Guelo Goodman, Eleanor Esmond White and LaRue Smith LaRue painting their fabulous Zulu room on the first floor in pure egg tempera, the only pure egg tempera produced in Britain in the 20th century. And there's one of Juter's works, The Arrival of Jan van Riebeck at the Cape of Good Hope, a work that was hugely controversial when it was unveiled, and a work that was absorbed into the National Collection but was lost sometime in the 1970s. I won't be as long on my others. This is a work called Lake Kivu by Clement Niels. I'm not going to talk too much about the actual painting, just in case Ian, who I think is doing a landscape painting, talk about tomorrow, just in case he looks at it. But just a few interesting tangential points. He was a Belgian, Clement Niels, born I think in 1921. And he wins a scholarship to the Belgian Congo in the mid to late 1930s, along with another artist from Belgium, Maurice van Esch. And Niels spends a lot of time in the area, in the Lake Kivu area, from about 1939 all the way up until about 1960. But this particular depiction is of Lake Kivu. This is the layout of the Belgian Congo before independence in 1960, and Lake Kivu, one of the great African lakes, is here just on the Rwandan border. But I suppose the point I would like to make is just that he was not the first I suppose South African artist, and I suppose we still see him as a South African artist, to make important trips to the Congo and Lake Kivu in particular. This is one of Niels's works from 1939 of a local figure there. And here, a near contemporary photograph of the area, and I think you can immediately recognize the similarities. This dates, I think, from probably the late 1940s or 1950s. Here, much, I think, later washy depiction of Lake Kivu, again by Clemens Niels. But the two major South African artists that visited the area included Irma. She visited in 1942 and again in 1946. The trip in 1942 was far more memorable and comfortable than her second trip in 1946. These are the kind of works she painted on those two trips. The one on the bottom right here is a scene, a gouache at Lake Kivu in 1946. This other magic portrait, some of you would recognize, a major work that we were lucky enough to sell in our Cape Town sale last year. A major work from that second Congo visit in 1946. Why was Stern there? She was an intrepid traveler. She had spent so much of her training and early career in Germany. It was essential to her that she had European or Eurocentric inspiration and touchstones, but of course during the war she was simply unable to travel to Europe, which is why she made these incredible painting trips into Africa. She of course went to Zanzibar as well as the Congo in 1942 and 1946. I quite like this comparison because the one on the right by Clemens Niels actually predates the Stern on the left by what, 6-7 years. And again, if you talk about the style, I think if you make this kind of comparison, you can get an idea of just how wonderfully expressive, how different Stern was in terms of other painters on the African continent, painting in the late 1930s and 1940s. Niels's work, I think, far more prosaic, yes, thinly painted, but I think the brush strokes aren't nearly as dynamic and as exciting and interesting, to put it simply. The other artist going up to Lake Kivu was this young man with his wingnut ears. This is a young Alexis Preller. Preller decided in 1939, a few years into his career, that he was going to get a better sense of an African spirit, and he thought he needed to do that by traveling up into the heart of the continent, which he does in 1939. He takes an old battered up van and he literally starts in Pretoria, sort of sets the compass north, and he drives all the way up to the Belgian Congo, and he gets there in 1939. He also happened to witness a volcanic eruption in the area, which played a significant role, certainly in the works that he produced in the next few years. Preller happened to be at Lake Kivu on the 1st of September 1939, which is when, of course, the ultimatum ran out and the world was at war. And terrified, he finds his way to the coast, and eventually he gets back to Pretoria. I think he gets back to Pretoria sometime in December of 1939. And he, of course, joins the war effort in 1940. He goes up to the North African campaign in 1941. He's a pacifist, but he does join the medical corps. And he is on the frontline medical surgeries in tents on the North African campaign, seeing these torn and ripped and mutilated bodies as they are brought in late at night under the cover of darkness. That's a military Preller with his helmet to the X over it, this sort of tall skeletal figure, traumatized like almost all of them were. He was taken a prisoner of war. He spent time in POW camps in Libya, in Italy, in Egypt, and he's eventually decommissioned, and he returns to Pretoria in 1943. And the work he produces thereafter is very much colored by his more recent experiences, obviously during the war, but in a painting like the work I'm showing you on the right, which is a fantastic work called Revelation, still heavily influenced by those few weeks he spent in this tropical danger zone in the Congo. And this work, I think, really sort of amalgamates those two experiences, these colonial green verdant jungles, but also this pink landscape ripped apart like a flesh wound. My final image is this one. It's by Malangatana Ngwenya. an artist who died in 2011, a Mozambican artist, one of the major Mozambican artists who I suppose developed an immediately recognizable kind of aesthetic, very much formed part of the independent struggles in Mozambique and other southern African countries. I'm showing it to you because not only is it a fantastic work, but it is, I always think, very undervalued. This is a lithographic multiple that I think is carrying estimates of about 3,000 to 5,000 rand. This is an artist of major international significance. And if you don't believe me, I suppose to prove it, there's a major Malangatana retrospective called Malangatana Mozambique Modern, which is currently installed at the Art Institute in Chicago. It was meant to run from the 21st of March to the 5th of July this year, sadly temporarily cancelled. I mean, one hopes that they are able to let it run for at least a few weeks before the next exhibition takes over. But the fact that the Art Institute of Chicago is dedicating a full retrospective to the artist gives you some indication of his international weight. And to have an example from his oeuvre in our current online sale at, I think, 3,000 Rand, is not only exciting, but also gives an idea of how many great bargains there are if you look very carefully and you understand a little bit about the background associated with some of these artworks. I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Al, for that incredibly insightful discussion. I know Ian has one or two points of input, and I think specifically on the Lake Kivu topic we were just discussing the other day when it came up. Ian, did you want to add anything on the Lake Kivu story?
Yeah, I was very interested in reading up about Lake Kivu and Senils, and it seemed like he started off there during the wartime, but it seemed that it was a bit vague, but it seemed that he went back there a little later in his life, Al.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Ian. There's very little information around. I mean, you know, I've read that he won that scholarship in 1936. I've also read that he went there in 1939. Van Esch, I think, did go to the Belgian Congo in 1939 on that scholarship. And I suppose because of the war, he fled the country and arrived in Cape Town in that year. As far as I'm aware, Senils remained in the Congo during the war. He went, I think, in 1945. After the war, I think he actually came to Johannesburg. What I have read is after that first trip he made, presumably in 1936, the work he produced there and the work that he brought back to Belgium caused a sensation. It was a complete sellout. Every work he painted, he sold. So they were enormously saleable, popular, exotic images. And they were, as I say, very successful. They were also very successful when they were exhibited in Johannesburg, I think in about 1945 and then later. But the way I understand it is that he kept returning to the Congo all the way up until about 1960. And I think that one work I showed was that much higher color key, those lighter, brighter blues and greens. I expect that's from a later period. But the actual Congo portraits come up very rarely by Senils. I think we all know Senils for his, I think sometimes quite insipid still lives with flowers. You know, very good paintings, often sort of incised and scratched through in terms of their surface. I expect at that point, which was presuming that in the 60s, he was very much painting to a formula, painting works that he knew his public would buy.
Yeah, he was working with the Peter Vanning Gallery, wasn't he? He was one of the stable of artists, so he was producing a lot of, I suppose, works for the market, principally, Al. So his initial vision would have been, I suppose, diluted in terms of just pure output.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's quite a nice comparison to make between Seniels and Van Esch, you know, because they both had a similar background, a similar training. They both were in the Belgian Congo just prior to the war. And of course, their aesthetic takes, diverts quite dramatically. You know, Van Esch started developing a far more simplified, I suppose in some ways, naive, brutal kind of an aesthetic, whereas Seniel certainly later on was far more gentle. His works sitting far more easily in homes, maybe, than some of Van Esch's works, although, of course, in terms of academic response and academic criticism, not to mention secondary market value, Van Esch has definitely sort of come out tops.
If I may just make a comment on one of your other choices, the Sipho Ndlovu. I think it's interesting to note that it is no coincidence that he painted that equestrian figure. Few people know it, but Sipho is actually a farmer himself, and he farms in the Villiers area, and he often paints scenes from you know, from Salise up to Clarence and Golden Gate and the like. So I was very pleased that you chose that one.
Thanks for that.
So I'm going to call it here, and I'm going to stay on the line for 3 to 5 minutes just to talk us through tomorrow. I'd like to just extend our thanks again to Dr. Alastair Meredith from our Joburg office. That was an incredibly insightful